better forum for me. So I'm very glad to be here today, we both are. Thank you for welcoming me and thank you for attending this workshop, because to me it's really important. So what's really exciting is we're here to make the first transvaginal mesh clinic of its kind in Australia, because so far the rest of the states aren't doing a fantastic job. And it's lovely. I want to acknowledge Teresa and her dedicated work. She's really listened to the voices of mesh injured women, and we feel like we've been truly heard, which is what's brought us here today. So I spent a lot of time thinking about how to deliver the message today. I thought about standing here and talking to a group of clinicians, part of a medical facility, and how this would feel. And as you can see, I'm feeling somewhat anxious, a bit shaky, my palms are sweaty, but we'll do this. So, since having this mesh experience, I have developed anxiety, something I'd never experienced as debilitating before. I've had other tumultuous times in my life in the past and have recovered well. However, this time I now suffer from PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, a more intense version of anxiety, and it is triggered in social situations, especially ones like these, where I don't know anybody, and more extremely when I'm faced with a medical professional. It makes me very anxious with the idea that anyone who may question the efficacy or validity of the story I'm about to share with you. I met Teresa in January after attending the old mesh clinic. My experience was somewhat traumatic and unuseful, sadly. The meetings that came after this, however, have led to us all being here today. I'm going to tell you my story about transvaginal mesh. It is unique, but it's sadly not uncommon. I'm 48 years young. I ran my own counselling practice for 20 years, and I'm a mum of 2 boys. After the natural birth of 2 rather large babies, my sons are currently 6'5" and 6'8". I grow giants, clearly. And as is common, I experienced SUI, stress urinary incontinence, for several years before all my friends got together and kind of gave me the nudge. You know, there's an operation for that. So what went through my mind was fabulous. Why bother with hours at the physio? A quick fix, that sounds like a good idea. So in 2011, I consulted 2 surgeons and was sold on a risk-free 20-minute procedure that would change my life. Well, that it did, but not in the way the surgeons told me it would. I remember waking up from surgery in a lot of pain and was told that that would pass. I'd had surgery after all, so I believed them and I waited. I remember being discharged from the Royal Women's Hospital and vomiting when I got to the car. When I got home, I crawled on my hands and knees up the stairs, took myself to bed to recover. I had a hectic life. My son has autism and took up a lot of time, so I soldiered on, hoping that at least I could sneeze without wetting myself now. Looking back at my medical notes, at my 3-month post-op surgery checkup, my incontinence was returning and the surgeon admitted he was at a loss to understand why. Life carried on in its busy fashion, yet I became fatigued, more so than usual. I simply believed it was my busy, stressful life, kids, mortgage, pets. I had no other explanation. I messed it up by writing on the board. Sorry, give me a moment. Over the next couple of years, I experienced recurrent UTIs, and as antibiotics gave me thrush, I sought out some natural therapies to cope with them. The operative word cope is important here, as we've all got busy lives, right? Over the years leading up to today, I found my health slowly slipping away from me. My vision of becoming a gym bunny again after my surgery in 2011 had still not come true, and my vitality was slipping away just as that vision was also. By 2013, I was experiencing multiple infections and was hospitalised for them 3 times that year. My stomach was constantly bloated. All food seemed to irritate it. I was always exhausted and I had multiple symptoms that I just couldn't explain, nor could any doctor I consulted. I was getting more and more unwell, so I started to become quite desperate for answers. I attended multiple GP and specialist appointments. I declared my list of operations, my family history. I had a father who was a surgeon, so I knew the drill, and told them of all my irregular and unexplained symptoms. By then, the list was something like that: recurrent infections, allergic reactions to food and common household products. That presented with rashes, itching, allergic reactions. I had an EpiPen at one stage. I had persistent fatigue, chronic back and pelvic pain. I was suffering insomnia. Over the 7 years, I gained over 25 kilos. I was always fluid retentive. I was suffering from acid reflux and a combination of 1 minute constipation, the next diarrhea. Brain fog was very debilitating. Extreme temperature sensitivity. 1 minute I would be sweating, the next minute I would be freezing. I lost a lot of hair. I was experiencing painful periods and a very foul smelling discharge from my vagina. By then I had total incontinence that was worse than before the operation. I had pins and needles and shooting pains through my limbs, and sex was too painful to bear. Hello. The list was increasing as the months and years rolled on. If you can imagine, just for a minute, I was a health-conscious, educated woman from a medical family. I was getting really, really frightened as I racked up more and more symptoms of ill health, and no doctor I saw had any answers for me. I was also finding, when trying to seek medical advice, feeling scared and anxious, that the doctor's responses became defensive at times. That I kind of understood, because after all, I was that one patient who kept demanding answers from them that they simply didn't have. And somehow in this process, I became the enemy. I thought I was going crazy. But in truth, it was worse than that. My lovely GP of 10 years, finally at his wit's end with me, announced that I needed a psychiatric assessment. If you can imagine, having worked in mental health since my early 20s, the message that I felt like I was perpetually hearing was, it's all in your head. This led me to quite a deep emotional spiral. Because my symptoms couldn't be explained, I must either be making them up or I must be crazy. I was completely deflated and destabilised by this, and stopped looking to the medical profession for answers. And to be honest, this is where a lot of women in my situation are also. We've disengaged from medical treatment due to the treatment of us when looking for answers and for help. In our culture, we're raised to go to doctors when we're unwell and for them to treat us. So many women in their fear and pain have reached out to the medical profession and have gotten no answers to their pain and ill health. And furthermore, worse treatment than no answers, because the message has been, because I cannot explain it, it mustn't be true. It may be useful for us all to keep this in our minds when engaging with women in the clinic that this is designed for. We are damaged. We react negatively. We're very scared, we're quite sick, and we're in a lot of pain. And that can cause bad behaviour in any human being. By 2015, my condition was so bad I spent days, weeks, and months in bed, suffering and becoming more and more isolated and more unwell. I was actually terrified I was going to die from this invisible illness that I didn't know what it was. I was no longer able to work or see clients face to face. I'd been living off my savings and racking up enormous medical bills in my quest for answers. My friends were becoming tired of my ailments and me not being able to fulfill my friendship duties. My sons were teenagers and no longer recognised their engaged and loving mother in that state. My husband left and my boys followed suit. I only had enough fight in me to simply survive. It felt like there was no help and no hope. By chance, in 2017, I plucked up the courage to go back to my implanting surgeon and complain about my worsened incontinence. I entered his office 6.5 years after my surgery, and within minutes was ushered out with him telling me he couldn't fit me in for the urodynamics study I required, but his colleague had more availability. His colleague agreed to fit me in the following day for the urodynamics study. I dutifully arrived alone and waited a few hours in emergency and was gowned up. I was led into a consulting room and a probe was waved in my face. Does everybody here know what a urodynamics study is? I would imagine so. That was my first red flag. He proceeded to numb my vagina and inserted the probe and watched the camera's screen. I was in shock to have had a probe inserted on what I thought was going to be a urodynamics study. The next red flag was his face. His face dropped. The screen was awash with white and blue. I reached for the screen, turned it round, and asked what that was. He then explained that the transvaginal mesh was skewering my urethra in several places. This is what it looked like. I was then left in a cold room in a gown for 30 minutes to contemplate what on earth was going on. I hadn't brought a friend for support. After all, it was only a urodynamics study. I was alone and in shock. I began to shake and feel very nauseated. My working brain started to search for answers and was feeling very suspicious at the lack of measuring of my urine and the treatment from the original surgeon palming me off to his colleague. I didn't know what was happening and I didn't know what it all meant. Needless to say, it was not good. You know when you're in shock and it feels like people are talking at you and you only get every third word? That was me in that room. The surgeon mumbled something about a class action and drew me a diagram of my urethra and the damage, and I nearly vomited on the spot. Then he delivered the prognosis of what could be done. His offer was that of multiple surgeries to try and remove the mesh if he was able to. If was not lost on me in that moment. He made me aware that there was a distinct possibility of a permanent catheter for the rest of my life. I was 47. I went home and I wept. In hindsight, I can only imagine that based on my symptoms and the insensitive treatment of me, that my original surgeon and his colleague knew exactly what was wrong with me before I did. I literally fell apart overnight. The relief of finding out what I thought was killing me was so overwhelming. The odds the surgeon gave me of any chance of recovery were simply not good enough. I was so unwell by this stage, I could barely walk more than 100 metres at a time. I couldn't stand for more than 5 minutes unassisted. I was mostly bedridden and my depression spiralled out of control. In my depression, one thing was clear to me. I didn't want life to go on like this. I decided I didn't want to live like a sick person and I didn't like the odds I'd been given. So last August, one night, I attempted to take my life. However, my plan was foiled as a friend called round, knowing how sensitive and vulnerable I was, and broke down the door when she couldn't raise me, and that's now history. But that was my rock bottom. Seeing as how I'd lived through that experience, I knew I needed help. And what does anyone do to get educated these days? We Google. I Googled. I made many inquiries of other women all around the world, the UK and the US in particular, as my research showed me I couldn't find a doctor in the UK or Australia, both countries of which I hold a passport, who inspired my confidence in their surgical skills to remove mesh. Mesh is a new thing, and this is what I was gathering and understanding more of. My sane brain was leading me to questions like, is there not a training course in removal? If there isn't, why isn't there? How would a surgeon know how to remove something that was deeply embedded in my vagina that had been there for 7 years and was meant to be a permanent device? The other question was, if they remove only some of it, surely my body wasn't going to have the chance to recover from the systemic illnesses, and so on. I googled further and found the Australian Pelvic Mesh support group on Facebook and a very helpful website written by a nurse. There were 60 other women who, like me, travelled to the US. Smart, brave women who spoke to me and told me what to anticipate. There were also a handful of smart, very brave women who'd had surgery for removal in Australia. Their stories were quite different. Not one of them was sure if they'd had a full or partial removal. They too had paid a significant sum of money for their surgery and didn't speak well mostly of their experiences. As I became more aware that thousands, hundreds of thousands of women around the world were also affected by their transvaginal mesh, I was astounded by the national lack of empathy and assistance shown to Australian mothers by the Australian government, TGA, RANZCOG, etc. So I turned to a US surgeons because the treatment and the odds and transparency seemed better. It came down to 2 surgeons for me, Dr. Veronicas in St. Louis or Dr. Raz from UCLA. What they were offering were full removals to women with evidence and with over 2,000 full removals in experience. It quickly became what I believed to be my only sane option to get well. I travelled alone at the cost of 50,000 Australian dollars to the US to seek the removal of my TVT implant. The surgery took over 7 hours. This is what it looked like as he went in. I have full evidence of a full removal and the photos taken on the way into my vagina and on the way out. These are the photos on the way out. Put down the film light. A very dear friend of mine so eloquently said, "Blind Freddie can see that shit was killing you." Here I am today, 8 months post-removal. I can walk, I can function, and I can be here to speak to all of you. Have I recovered? Well, some of my symptoms have disappeared. I'm not going to get up. However, removal is not the end of the journey. The symptoms that have gone are the persistent fatigue, the chronic back and pelvic pain. I only have days of that rather than all of the time. My insomnia is fine now. I've lost 15 kilos. I'm no longer fluid retentive. The acid reflux and all of that is gone. I'm no longer allergic to everything. The brain fog has cleared. And the extreme temperature. My hair's growing back. My periods are better. I haven't got a foul-smelling vagina any longer. The incontinence is another story. But pretty much most of those things, have improved dramatically in the last 8 months. However, removal is not the end of the journey for most women. Women are reporting better able to manage systemic illnesses without mesh in their body, yet some are still crippled with pain and just managing. Until we can acknowledge the problem and put some energy into the research, it's really hard to know how and why this happened. Since I re-engaged with my GP, we've been testing my symptoms. My current diagnosis list is pre-diabetic, Hashimoto's, thyroid disease, fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue, nerve pain, and PTSD with an acute anxiety disorder. That's what I'm working on. And interestingly, there's no family history of any of these things in my family. I promise to stop talking soon, because if I don't, I can quote attention span statistics to all of you, or I could have yelled sex very loudly every 5 minutes to keep half of the audience awake. I hope today, a part, if not all of my story, will resonate with some of you. But if it doesn't, I also understand that too. I get it. My life-altering experience feels and sounds like what I can only describe as a bad movie. The kind of American movie where we see Big Pharma, the government, regulating bodies, and some of the medical fraternity shown to behave in a less than ethical light because of the power of the dollar. A conspiracy theory type movie where Big Pharma's made a big mistake and is now covering their tracks using their great power and influence, perhaps. However dramatic I can make that movie sound, sadly it feels like the story of my life for the last 7 years. I don't know the ending to my movie, whether I will be a fully functioning member of society, pain-free again, able to work, enjoy my life, have lots of sex, or feel just a little carefree sometimes and not worry about my health and future having lost so much. I do know I need to feel empowered by the support people around me and have an acknowledgement that something really terrible happened, and it happened to me and other women. Maybe it wasn't on purpose, but it still happened. And it's really sad and has been devastating on so many levels. I'm very cognizant that the transvaginal mesh issue is a minefield, both politically and litigiously. And this can cause a sense of mistrust, and we can feel like we're the enemy. But please believe me, we don't want to be. We want to work collaboratively and we need help. We need reassurance, empathy, and support. There has been a Senate inquiry and there is a class action in its final stages. This is an acknowledgement of sorts in that those of us who have had adverse reactions to mesh, that they have been severe and life-altering. For most of us, the journey doesn't end with removal. It ended for a friend of mine, Chrissy Brajic, a Canadian wife and mother of 2 young boys. She had a TVT in 2013 and died in 2017, aged 42, from sepsis. She'd become antibiotic resistant 2 years after her removal surgery. Alison Blake of Queensland took her own life in June 2015, 2 weeks after a doctor told her nothing could be done to ease her pain or address the devastating consequences of her pelvic mesh device surgery. Her notes included, "I simply cannot bear to be lying on a couch for months on end, to rely on catheters, enemas, temazepam, painkillers, and be a burden on my family and friends." Michelle McDougall died at 55 last month. She'd been suffering for 20 years from the side effects of hernia mesh. Multiple surgeries and complications had left her too weak to have the chemotherapy she needed. Women, mothers, aunts, grandmas, wives and daughters in Australia are suffering. Through the Australian Pelvic Mesh Support Group, I have spoken to women ranging as young as 29 to 71. They're suffering, and as a counsellor and a mesh-injured woman, I feel their pain. They're not able to care for young children. They're missing out on playing with their grandkids. Some are using wheelchairs to engage in most normal life activities, if and when they're well enough to. They're on pain medication for the rest of their lives. They're depressed. They're isolated. Their marriages are breaking down due to the lack of sexual intimacy. They've lost their jobs, careers, and are suffering financial hardship and premature death. As a group of mesh-injured women, we don't get the luxury of having a disease like cancer. With cancer, you have a diagnosis, you have a prognosis, you have studies you can rely on for odds of survival and treatment. There's trialled medication, there's government supports, there's financial assistance, and support for families when you have cancer. Everyone knows what cancer is. It's understood as a health issue. You get sympathy and empathy. With mesh, we haven't yet. When I spoke with Dr. Jenny King and Chris Burness, they had estimated that 150,000 women have mesh for SUI or pelvic organ prolapse. So there are potentially many, many more women, plus the women who came before those women before the packaged mesh devices were on the market. Some of them may be okay, or some of them, like me, are just ready to give up. We simply don't know. Because unlike if you have a faulty car, your airbag in the car, you'd have a recall. You'd get notified by phone or letter. Your car would come back into the garage, it would be fixed. You may or may not get compensated, and your world would go on. Your life would go on as before. But sadly, in 2018, no one can provide a system for a recall yet. And even more sadly, no one seems particularly interested in doing so. So I will stop talking now. Thank you for listening. I hope by sharing my story and my experience with you, in some way it will give you something to keep in your minds and in your hearts when dealing with mesh injured women. There are hundreds of us out there, and we need your help, but more importantly, we need your empathy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Justine.